Hello, I'm Eugene Lang, and I've got with me here today Ian Riley, who is the president of the 7th Town Historical Society. Also, we are taping this show over at Amitersburg, where we do a lot of them, at the Marilyn Adams Genealogical Research Center. And tell me, what do we have on tap today?
Well, just before I tell you that, I just want to tell you that we've missed you the last 3 or 4 shows that we did. And we've had to say that a couple of them that you weren't here, and then it was obvious you weren't here, and so we're really glad to have you back.
Where do you think I was?
Well, I think I understand that you were out doing some other work in some other areas.
No, I was in Norway.
Oh.
A lot of people wanted me to go to Norway. And you know why? Because there's a town there in Norway called Hell. And people say to me, why don't you go to Hell? Anyhow.
Well,
so,
I believe that. I think I said that a couple of times too. You worked in the post office.
Well, we're not going to go as far as Hell today. We're going to go up the, we're going to have 2 guests here from Renfrew.
That we are.
Which is a lot closer than Hell.
But they're going to actually talk about a different kind of a hell, as I
That's
understand
right.
it, that was imposed on a segment of our society. And I'm going to leave you in a moment and introduce you to David and Kay Lorente, who are going to talk about the plight of the home children. And some people know about the home children, and some people don't. But I know over the next 2 shows that we're going to be producing today and the next one, which will the second one we broadcast 2 weeks after they see this one. I think people will understand what I said with that some of these people, children they're talking about, might have just found themselves almost in hell.
I have with me here today David and Kay Lorente from the town or city of Renfrew, which is quite a distance from here, northeast of Belleville. And the first question I'm going to put to both of you, why are you here?
Well, we're here to talk about the home children, those children who were sent over to Canada from Britain starting in about 1869.
But you're also going to give a talk here, are you not, publicly?
Yes, tomorrow.
Yes, we're talking tomorrow to the Quinty group here.
I see. How did you get interested in this field of endeavor?
Well, my father was a home child. And as a child, I grew up with relatives on one side of the family and none on the other. We were told not to talk, not to ask questions, you know. And so, and like most home children, like all home children, even the ones sent to good families, home children did not talk. And it was only a year or so before my father died in '65 that a couple of inklings came out that he was a child when he came over here. That I didn't know. And in the 70s, about 10 years later, I found out that what the word home child meant. I didn't know what that meant.
And what part of Ontario did he come to?
He came to Renfrew County, which I didn't know when I moved to Renfrew County to teach, to the northern reaches, to a place called Killaloo.
I know it.
You know Killaloo. It was Rockingham near Killaloo.
Yes, no,
that's right. And there was a pitchfork incident, and then he moved to a place near Ottawa called Happy Valley, which is now Fallowfield. And that was a happy placement, but the first one wasn't.
Well, see, you were talking about the home children. There was a book came out about 15 years ago called The Little Immigrants, and it had to do with them coming to Guelph. They were known as the Barnardo homes.
Well, no, the people who went to Guelph wouldn't have been Barnardos. Barnardo had 2 homes, basically 2 headquarters, one in Toronto, one in Peterborough. And he was one of about 50 agencies that sent people to 50. Most people talk about home children. They very often call themselves Barnardo children.
Yeah, that's right.
It's not a generic term, you know. I tell people who do that, not all colas are Cokes.
Did you ever hear of the Marchman children?
The Marchman, yes. Now, well, that was not a Barnardo home,
No.
except for a couple of months. That was an Annie McPherson home.
Yes.
And Annie was a fine broth of a
And
gal.
where was the Marchman home?
Marchman home is in Belleville.
Right.
We have pictures here of it. We came down to reunions. We invited the Barnardo people. Barnardos have the McPherson records. And it was in Annie's charge from 1870 until 1925.
That far,
That's right, over 50 years. And then it was handed over with the other McPherson homes in Stratford and so on to Barnardos. All the records were handed over as well. And it became a Barnardo home for a couple of months, and then it was closed.
Barnardo himself, what line of work was he in? Was he not a minister?
I think I'll ask my wife to do that.
Yes, Kay.
Well, as far as I know, Barnardo was not a minister. He said he was a doctor. He's often called Dr. Barnardo.
He called Dr. A.
But in fact, he faked his medical certificate. However, I believe he had good intentions in the work that he did. He really became interested in the children in the streets of London because he was interested originally in becoming a missionary. And he joined a philanthropic organization in London. I just can't think of the name of it at the moment, but it was during that work that he saw these children running the streets of London and decided to do something about it. Now, others had already done it, as we've said. McPherson and Maria Rye was another one. But he became the best known of them all. And one reason is that he kept very good records.
Did he ever come to Canada?
Yes, he did. Maybe you wanted to address that.
Yes, he came to Canada many times, but as Kay said, he sent thousands of children to Canada before he actually had a home here in 1882 in Toronto. He sent children through McPherson. If he had children, he'd sent them over to her. There was an internet that was at work there. The Scott Quarrier, who had a home in Brockville, Fairno home, before he had his home in Brockville, he sent children too through Annie Person.
Was he subsidized? Where did the money come to send them out?
In the whole history, and I've been looking into this since my father died in '65, in the whole history that I have analyzed, there's very little that has to do with money, with where the money came from. But we do know that in the period before child migration officially started in 1869, there were kickbacks. This is when they had penal colonies, and they were there were kickbacks. There was a big scandal, for instance, in Glasgow, and elsewhere too, but particularly in Glasgow. The judges were getting kickbacks from the shipping companies to send people to the colonies so that they would have human cargo ballast in their ships and the cattle boats that were bringing cattle to England and going back empty to North America.
Did they also go to Australia too? Yes.
When they stopped sending children to Canada, in Ottawa, the home closed in '32. The Barnardo home closed around '39 in Ottawa. In Toronto, there were 76 children sent to Canada between 1945 and 1948. This is after the war, to Vancouver, to Vancouver Island, to the Fairbridge home out there. That's when it all stopped, actually, in Canada. But the Attlee government, after Churchill was kicked out in England, the Attlee government actually continued, and so did the governments following it, sent children to Australia and New Zealand and South Africa until 1967.
That late,
That late. It's scandalous, really. And these children were lied to. They were told that their parents were killed during the Blitz. They weren't. The parents were told that the children were adopted by good homes in England. So there are lawsuits in Australia now. And that's one of the interesting things. They also sent children to Africa.
How about India?
No, not to India.
Not
They
India.
sent to Natal. So they were sent to Natal. They were sent to Valparaiso. They were sent to other places as well. Jamaica is another example.
Did these children ever learn of their actual background, who their mothers or fathers were?
Well, some of them, yes, a good many have found something. Actually, when we had our first reunion in 1990, that's really the first that we know of that anybody was doing anything to help the home children find their ancestors. A lot of them had tried, and they had written to Barnardo's, for instance, or another agency if they knew where to write. But even Barnardo's, up to that point, was very reluctant to send records or give information to these children. Around that time, they changed, they hired a new person, to the head of aftercare, they call it. And this new person was like a broom sweeping the place clean. She changed everything.
In
and
what
her
regard?
idea, well, in regard to releasing information, in regard to realizing and understanding that these people had a right to their records. They had a right to their history if they had it available. And of course, they do have very many records. They have about 50,000 records, Barnardo's. They even have records of children that they weren't responsible for sending over, like they have the McPherson records and other groups. So it's a real good source for obtaining information.
Well, did the British government ever step in to say, let these records come out?
Because of the lawsuits in Australia, a lady by the name of Margaret Humphreys started a group called the Child Migrant Trust out of Birmingham, and in that area. And she led marches about 12, 13 years ago on the British Parliament, with the result, ultimately, that the British Parliament did set up an all-party committee with the health, because the health department was in charge of responsibility later on, the Health Select Committee, they called it, to look into the British government's role and responsibility vis-a-vis child migrants, the welfare of child migrants. We found out about it. This was in July '97. We found out about it. We submitted a brief. What we saw in only one newspaper in Canada was that we got from the rather mixed up write-up that they were only going to be dealing with Australia. And sure enough, they were. They were only interested in Australia.
Why?
Because they're the only ones who threaten lawsuits.
I see.
Voila. You see?
Nobody in Canada-
10,000 people to Australia and New Zealand. Maybe 7. Only 7,000. But the whole government concern was with those two places. We submitted a brief.
I just wanted to bring out there that there were 100,000, possibly more than 100,000 sent to Canada, and they were interested in only the 7 to 10,000 sent to Australia. So that was really a little bit annoying to us.
I guess so.
Just
When
a bit.
And the 40 to 43 sent elsewhere to South Africa and all these other places. There's no concern for them at all.
Well, when these children came out, were they told in advance that it was going to be a better life? Were they told they were going to go to the type of home they went to, or were they given some kind of a cooked-up line that you're going to have some milk and honey out here?
Oh yes, there were even pamphlets over there showing this as the land of milk and honey. I think that was the title on one of them. And the children, they were very young in many cases. You know, they were as young as 4 years old.
Oh.
And they thought they were going on a field trip in many cases. They were told to raise their hands if they wanted. Where did he want to go? Australia or Canada, or join the forces for the boys. And they raised their hand, or they went to this corner if they were going to Canada, or that corner
They
over
had
there.
that choice.
They had the choice. And of course, most of them didn't know one thing about Canada or Australia or the forces.
They had no choice to stay in Britain.
They had to get out.
They had to go.
Well, when they came to Canada, we'll say they're 4 or 5, what I was thinking about, how long did they have to stay in these homes? So they're 15, 16, when did they say, get out, go on your own?
Well, mostly in the receiving homes or the distribution homes, whichever you want to call them, they only stayed overnight or for a weekend in those particular homes, and they were shipped out right away to the people who had asked for them. You know, if they were already booked. Like, for instance, Dave's father stayed overnight, I believe it was, at St. George's on Wellington Street in Ottawa, and the following day, or must have been through the night, he was sent on a train by himself up to Killaloo, and got in there at 4 o'clock in the morning.
He had no choice?
No choice. He got in there at 4 o'clock in the morning in February, weather like today, but probably a lot more snow, and he had to wait at the train station till 8 for the farmer to pick him up.
Did he know in advance that he was going to go to Killaloo, or was that the surprise at the end?
No, he would know that in advance. And in fact, they had a little sign, they all had a little card on them giving their name and the farmer and the place they were going to and the name of the farmer. That was on like a tag.
Uh-huh.
So that's all.
What percentage were females, were girls?
Probably, I would say 45% of them. There were a few more boys than girls, I believe. But the list that we have depends on the agency. Maria Rye specialized in girls. She's the one who started it in 1869 with the first home, which she called our Western Home, down at Niagara-on-the-Lake. And she bought this former jail and refurbished it, and brought these children over in '69, lined them up in this large room. She had placed ads in the newspaper in the States as well as in Canada, saying that this domestic help was available. And people simply came and looked at them and took what they wanted and walked out.
Something like a white slave trade.
There was, and darn few records kept. As a matter of fact, Maria Rye's records are almost up. They're mixed up with the Department of Agriculture. records in Ottawa. Now, you asked about what money was to be made. I mentioned kickbacks in England.
Mm-hmm.
And you also asked how long did they stay in the home. If a family fell on bad times, which means if one parent died, basically, then that child would be taken, say he was 10 years old, would be taken, and according to the government poor law,
Mm-hmm.
the child had to live in the home. It was a ward of the state until that child was school-leaving age, which was 14. So a 10-year-old would be kept for 5 years. Now, it was cheaper to put the child on a boat and send it across the ocean and save approximately the same cost of keeping the child for a year and save yourself 4 years. So there was, it lowered the taxes on the people in Britain to ship them out, okay? There were push and pull factors. There was the whole philosophical idea that wide open spaces and hard labor made for good citizens. You see? And Canada had lots of wide open spaces. It was the Industrial Revolution.
That's true.
That's right.
Did most of the children come from Greater London, or did they come from Manchester or Leicester or Glasgow?
Cardiff and Liverpool. They came from the industrial centres, which during the Industrial Revolution people gyrated to. And of course, during the famine, and there were several famines. There was not just the potato famine. 300,000 Irish came to Liverpool. Liverpool didn't even have sewers. They were just putting in infrastructure at the time. So there was all kinds of infestation where, people were dying. And so there was a darn good reason to get on ships and leave that place.
What was the mortality rate, say, coming out on these ships from Great Britain? It would take a couple of weeks maybe in those days?
Well, yes, it did take several weeks. Sometimes when the ships had sails or were sail-assisted ships, the wind sometimes blew them back and they had to start over again. But you asked about the mortality rate. Normally 4%. Some years it went up to 8%. When Barnardo brought over babies, because they did bring children under the age of 4, actually. They did bring over babies from a place called Hawkhurst Castle in England. The rate went up to 20% in 1 year. So they decided they wouldn't bring babies over anymore.
These babies on the ship? Did
Well,
they
these
have a
would-
doctor and nurses, or just the older teenagers?
Well, can you imagine coming over with 200 children? In the early days, they had to provide their own food. They had to provide their own bedding. And they had to do their own cooking. And you have 1 or 2 people in charge. Maria Rye generally stayed in first class. And God knows who looked after the kids down below in steerage.
When she came over in first class, was it a letdown when she hit Canada and she was second and third class where she finally wound up?
Maria Rye was the lady in charge, so
see.
There was no letdown as far as she was concerned because she was back and forth all the time.
Oh, they had people going back
That's right,
and forth.
and she got herself a pension. Well, she was in the business for a while, until about 1895.
Did the Salvation Army come in and try to help?
Yes, Mr. Booth in England worked among the poor, did maps showing where most of them lived and so on, and yes, did send people over here, the Church Army.
Most of them came to Ontario. How about Quebec, because that's a French-speaking province then?
The Anglican Church, the Church of England, sent all its boys to Quebec.
Did?
Yeah, to Sherbrooke.
And how about the Catholic?
To the Gibbs home. The Catholic boys, and there's a reason for that. The Catholic boys and girls, I would say about 60%, 60 to 67% went to Quebec. Originally, the distribution home was in Montreal, but then it was difficult trying to find English homes, so they moved it up to Ottawa. And from 1904, every Catholic child was placed through Ottawa. Now, if a Catholic child was placed down in Nova Scotia, the Catholic child would probably come to Ottawa first and then hop a train and go down to Nova Scotia. They were placed in the Maritimes. They were placed in Quebec. They were placed in Ontario. They were placed in Manitoba. The furthest home west for people coming in to Canada up to the time of Fairbridge, who opened Duncan on the island, was Winnipeg. And Barnardo had a farm at a place called Russell, Manitoba.
Oh, he went that far west.
That's right.
Say that these children came out, and after, we'll say, a week or 2 weeks, they found the situation intolerable, and they escaped from the farm where they were, or escaped from Barnardo where the Marchmont home. What happened to them when the law caught up with them?
Well, usually they went back, if they could, back to the distribution home. For instance, Dave's father, from the first farm in Killaloe, or around that area, he went, but managed to get back to Ottawa, to the distribution home, and from there they sent him to Fallowfield, which was a good placement. They had a great many placements, these children. They generally got back to the agency if they could, because, you know, don't forget, they knew nothing about this country. The only thing they knew was this place that they had come from. So they didn't just wander around, you know, looking or being strays on the streets. They tried to get back, and that home then tried to place them again.
I see.
And they had as many as, the boys, I believe, had 8 different placements, usually, on average, and the girls had as many as 12. So imagine what that did to a child's self-esteem. Rejected by one family after another in many cases.
Terrible. What about segregation between the males and females? I mean, let's face it, the human condition. Say there were some teenagers came out. Were there sexual activities there?
Yes, there was.
And the children of that?
A comparatively recent study within the last 30 years of records done at the major agencies. Now, these would be reported cases of abuse, showed that there was 67 to 70% of them were abused. Yeah.
But Dave, I think you were asking if there was activity among the home children themselves. We have no evidence of that, although it may have occurred. And from our knowledge of at least St. George's home, where we have visited, they had separate dormitories and separate people to look after them in each dormitory. What Dave was mainly referring to is the abuse that was when the child was sent to an isolated farm, for instance. The farmer or the farmer's son or hired man or whatever, you know, did what they liked. We know that we have evidence of cases of abuse, and it wasn't only sexual; it was tremendous physical abuse. We have the records. We have the records of a young boy, the court records, the judge's statements, and it's pages. I forget how many pages exactly, where he talks about how the child was buried in a small box, which was too small for the body, and so the body was twisted up to fit the box, and there were still traces of manure in the box, and so on and so forth. He describes the wounds on the body and so on. This case, and that farmer, well, I don't believe he was even really convicted of that, was he? He was convicted, yeah.
Justice?
He was convicted of it, but what I guess what I recall from it that made me question that was that the judge said that the local clergyman knew about it, knew that the child was being abused. Many of the neighbors knew about it, and none of them did a thing.
There was a boy by the name of Ewart that it is thought that he was murdered out in Winnipeg. Arnold Walsh was the boy that Kay is talking about, the Irishman over on the Quebec side in Masson, who was brought to justice, was sent for 7 years to St. Vincent's Penitentiary in Quebec, for charged with manslaughter by neglect. Manslaughter by neglect. Everett Green was murdered and at the turn of the century, and that was the big cause célèbre because he was murdered by a woman. She eventually got off, but there was no doubt about it. She took axe handles to him and everything else. And that was the case that brought the abuse situation to the attention of most people in Canada and Britain. And then there was some intervention by the Canadian government saying, we're going to accept some responsibility to have these children inspected in a better way. You see, the children were supposed to be inspected every year.
Medically?
Once. No, a visit by somebody from the sending agency. Now, we know that some of these people lied through their teeth. They said they visited 3,000 people. There's no other way they could do it. Not in the horse and buggy days.
I guess not.
And they couldn't do it with a car today, unless they had a reunion someplace, But getting to remote areas, no, it was absolutely impossible. We'll talk about that when we do our sort of little dialogue together, because we do not think very much about the credentials that some of these inspectors have. But the point is, once a year. So if a girl is being abused, after the inspector leaves, she's going to have to wait a year before there's... When the people come from England, the aftercare social workers come from England, I like to take them out into a countryside up in Renfrew County, take them out late in the afternoon and show them some of the barns and buildings that the children lived in. You know,
Still exist.
They still exist, yeah. And then on the way home after dark, stop between farms where the farms are maybe 10 or 15 miles apart. Stop on a country road, stop the car, turn the lights out, sit there in the dark, and say, now, you saw that farm 5 miles up the road? You know, if somebody's abusing you, what are you going to do? You're afraid of wolves, you're afraid of bears, you have no lights. It's going to get lost in the woods.
Terrible
You know,
condition.
my father ran away from a pitchfork incident and hid for 2 days in the woods until the people found him. Here's a kid from London. Brought up
When
in
they
London.
found him, what happened?
They sent him back to the home in Ottawa. And again, as Kay said, he had a very wonderful placement after that.
What percentage of these children turned out very successfully in later life?
I would say virtually all of them.
They
Now,
did.
there would be some who became alcoholics and who succumbed to the same pressures that other people would in our society. But I would say most of them did. When Romeo Leblanc gave his first speech, he talked about the need to recognize children and their accomplishments, and the need to recognize the quiet heroes in our society who lead quiet lives. And I thought he was talking about home children, except I knew better. You know, I really did know better. And I was very impressed by that particular talk. And I think it's the home children who made a very great contribution to our society. The ones I've known are wonderful, wonderful people. And I've met hundreds of them.
You have met that many.
That's right.
Well, our time has come to an end, and I want to thank David Lorente and his wife Kay for coming all the way from Renfrew
The fruit.
to be with us today. And I hope that it won't be too far distant in the future, that you'll come back again. And congratulations and on your worthwhile work in regards to the migrants, we call it the home children. So we're going to say goodbye, and how can I sign off? Oh, the same old question. What's in a name? I'm Eugene Lang.